The first speaker for the day, or presenter, is Ms. Karyn Walsh, and she's the CEO of the Micah projects. Welcome, Karyn.
Karyn, welcome. If you could just state your name for the record, and you've got 15 to 20 minutes. We'll ask some questions and have a conversation, and then there may be comments from the floor. Thank you.
My name is Karyn Walsh. I'm CEO of Micah Projects, a not-for-profit organisation based at South Brisbane and providing services across Brisbane. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and elders past and present, and from the outset just the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in both homelessness and in the justice system. What I'm presenting today is just some of the evidence that we have from a campaign that we did for 3 years called 500 Lives, 500 Homes, which has also been backed up by some national data analysis, which was collating the 4 cities that had undertaken campaigns as well, which also sort of reflects the extent to which homelessness, the criminal justice system, and particularly rough sleeping are linked, and that people are caught in a vicious cycle because we're not providing the right solutions at the right time. So I'd like to both give the evidence of the issue but also the solution around supportive housing and making sure that we're providing a service system that ends people's homelessness rather than manages their homelessness, so that they're on a cycle of emergency accommodation, prison, hospitals, and short-term homeless services. So basically we believe that there's money to be saved for the taxpayer, even though the systems that money is costing a lot more in probably don't think they get any savings. But if we put better interventions in, people's homelessness would actually be ended, and their interaction with the criminal justice system has been proved to go down. So over the 2014 to 2017, we surveyed 2,694 individuals or families. That was the adults in those families, but of those families, 1,522 children were present. They weren't surveyed. So, children are part of the equation in terms of people, the displacement of their parents in terms of homelessness and imprisonment. The interaction with the justice system was 1,268 adults had been engaged in the previous 6 months. So it was self-reporting, which is a valid way of reporting, and it is indicative. So we're not saying it's actual service utilisation, we're just saying it's indicating. 25% of that 1,268 were female, 74% were male, 1% identified as transgender, 50% were sleeping rough, 22% were Indigenous, and 10% identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual. The average age was 42 years, and the average time of homelessness was 4.7 years. The indicative costs for the criminal justice system was $5,941,107, and the health system was $16,172.14, which you've got that data. The solution that we put forward is that supportive housing, which is providing housing that is affordable at 30% of people's income, not a percentage of market rent, because people do not have more than New Start, and when people get out of prison they don't even have a full New Start payment for the first 2 weeks. So basically it is combining that affordability, whether it's in the private market through subsidy, public housing or community housing, with the support services. I don't know what the figures today are about the number of people in prison because of no fixed address who are eligible for parole, but very clearly if those people were offered housing with the services they need to reintegrate into the community and a pathway, which is really important, to permanent stable housing, then the costs would definitely go down. However, a word of caution, I don't think everyone should only get a service just because they've been in prison or exiting prison. We should be providing them so they don't go in the first place. So through court programs or even before court, our goal is to end rough sleeping in Brisbane so that no one is living on the street. Clearly we haven't got there yet. But supportive housing, Brisbane Common Ground is the example that the data has been based on 41 people with service utilisation costs, where the researcher actually looked at what was the service utilisation of the criminal justice system, the hospital system, and the cost of providing the housing and the support 12 months while they were on the street and the 12 months while they were in housing. And that showed a $13,100 per tenant saving after the costs of housing and support were looked at. It also showed a really big decrease in nights in custody, use of the watch house, appearances in court were down by 50 to 24. People were less victimised. 50% of people rough sleeping have reported victimisation themselves, as well as people who may be offending, and most haven't accessed services for that trauma. There's also obviously the comorbidity of mental illness, addiction and chronic disease that about 70% of people on the street often have. Basically we would say that if we were investing in we should be increasing New Start so that people actually have more income to pay for their housing, but from a state perspective, if we're investing in housing and for those who need it, providing the appropriate support. So not everyone needs the same kind of support. Some people may need more clinical support. If they have a mental illness, people who have been in prison the longest obviously need assistance in re-entry. People who are offending for minor offences need assistance to look at stopping offending. So in the UK, there's a program that was referred to as Supporting People, and basically it was an investment by the government into supporting people in whatever housing they were in and with the dosage of support they needed, and the individualised support, which is also a form of scattered site in the outreach in the community or on site if it was in hostels or high density buildings. That investment, which I can send you the program on that, but it was really not having to wait till people were leaving a hospital, leaving a prison. It was people could self-refer, so early intervention as well as referrals for when people were exiting. So I think a lot of Queensland's investment into social services is at the tertiary end, and we need to make sure we put some of it at the early intervention end where people can, as citizens, seek the services they need before they get referred through a criminal justice system or a tertiary hospital system. Any questions?
So that's the end of the formal part of your presentation,
yes.
Karyn?
I need to say that the rate of youth detention and the correlation between youth detention and imprisonment is quite high, and that Indigenous people, it's very high. It's much more than non-Indigenous.
Let me kick off with the first question. You've indicated there's a substantial saving available potentially after meeting clients' needs. There's still money in the kitty. You've consulted widely, and your sample size sounds representative. Have you had any interaction with service providers or government in the process and articulated your findings?
Of course.
And reactions?
Well, I think that we're in a stage where the tertiary costs are outweighing the preventative costs. Housing should be infrastructure, and a right. It shouldn't be a service as such, and services should partner with housing providers or the government as a housing provider for that matter in order for people's needs to be met, so that they basically have a physically safe home, that they have the individualised support which they need, which we would say is only about 30% of the people who come through homeless services. Other people need short-term, and then those who need it long-term, there's cost savings in stability, not moving people through short-term accommodation, prison, and people are getting so much debt, like they've got to pay debt, they've got to pay a court fee when they go to court, they've got spur debts for move-on powers. Some of those fines are more than their weekly income.
Yep.
So then those spur debts mean they have to be paid off, then people can't sustain their tenancy because they haven't got enough income, because they're paying off a debt as well as trying to pay their rent, as well as trying to access services. So more and more people have to pay for services, and there's enormous health inequalities. Some people get better health services in prison than they do in the community.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Which isn't acceptable, really.
Just wanting to know, Karyn, did the survey reveal whether, for example, somebody was homeless and then committed their first offence, or were they
No,
coming
it was
out
their
of
interaction with the criminal justice. So in the past 6 months, had they had an interaction with the watch house or the criminal justice or been in prison?
Yeah, and similarly, have they then come out of prison and then found themselves homeless? So perhaps not
definitely.
homeless
We have people
before.
come to our service regularly who have just been released from prison, and within the first fortnight, or when they don't have much income. We had a man released from prison who had 3 weeks to live. He had been diagnosed, he had esophageal cancer, and he basically had been told that he had a month or so to live. Luckily we could get him into housing quickly so that he died with dignity, but he was released with no links to any health service. There isn't a referral system from the prison, really. People, like the health practitioners, don't always know when people are going to be released, so the referrals to health services in the community, they're minimal, and certainly people's ability to automatically be able to pay rent is really compromised because they just get a half payment, and even a full payment's not enough.
Yeah.
So usually they have to go into emergency accommodation, which some people don't want to because they're large congregant places, and just being from prison they might choose to sleep rough to experience that. A bit of freedom and fresh air is what someone said to me recently.
Gee whiz. Karyn, what's the link between people that find themselves in these circumstances and then recidivism, or going back to prison, offending again and going back?
Poverty and no support, and we would say not being housed.
So
Like
we
if you
could
don't
solve
have a
some of
safe
those.
place to live, all sorts of things happen when you're on the street, and conflicts occur. A lot of people are robbed regularly. People have addictions that they're not getting treated for. People have suicidal ideation, which they're not being treated for. We tend to be screening people out of our health system, not into it. And, so people are very unwell, and all sorts of minor offending can occur, as well as very serious offending.
Could you amplify the point a little that you made about screening people out of the health system rather than
Well,
screening
if people present, I think it's 25% of people have presented prior to a successful suicide within 72 hours. So if they're not at a threshold for a hospital to respond, then they should be being referred somewhere for another intervention. So I think that, it's a bit of a cycle around the pressure that is on all the tertiary services. But instead of continuing to constantly invest in those services, we need to invest in community-based diversity. We need a diverse range of services. We need Indigenous managed services. We need women's services. So we shouldn't just have one service that does it. It needs to be the services in the community need to reflect the diversity of the community.
So this isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but if there were a range of services, the appropriate services could be selected for particular individuals' needs. So
Definitely. And people can self-select their service, which I think is something we're losing because of such controlled referral pathways. We're overemphasising referral and case coordination and not actually having case management.
Right.
People need, if they don't have family, if they've been incarcerated for a long time, even if they're short-term incarceration, they've got to go back. They've got their court date. Sometimes they just get a house, and often we pay their rent if we know it's going to be short-term to prevent them losing that house. So strategies that really plan with somebody, well, how long is this likely to be? Can we prevent them from losing their housing? Can they come back to housing? But most importantly, get the support they need. I mean, people leave prison after being in there 15 years, and it's a huge issue to be able to reintegrate into the community if they don't have permanent housing and if they don't have the support they need. And there are prison support services. Often there's a time limit on how long those services can be provided. The real benefit of what is referred to as an intervention of supportive housing is that you give the amount of service a person needs ongoing if they need it. All our service models and programs are focused on short-term quick interventions, but we know that 30% we would say of the people who access this survey, for example, they need ongoing support, but self-reliance isn't achievable because they don't have family, they may not have capacity. The number of people with intellectual disabilities who are before the courts and going to prison and coming out without the right supports is significant and underreported, like it's not. And certainly those people aren't getting NDIS. So
I was going to ask you about people that may have intellectual disability. What happens for those individuals who may be coming out of prison, or those individuals who are homeless and then going into prison in terms of some service pathways?
Well, often we're not assessing people's disability appropriately, and I think there's a real issue about people being assumed that they may have an addiction rather than understanding what their capacity is in the first place. And some people with intellectual disability have lost services, and unless they will go through the process of assessment with NDIS, there's a barrier to them getting the support they could get from NDIS. But mostly there's a significant proportion of those people who need case management services, not just individualised plans.
Yeah.
And they need services that will focus on how do you be a good tenant, how do you maintain your parole, how do you stop offending, as well as really looking at what are their aspirations in life, what is their health needs that can be responded to. People have significant chronic illness and they're not being screened early. They're preventable diseases and they're dying in their 40s. So, there's a whole piece of work around how you could provide these services in a more thorough way earlier so that people can access them voluntarily versus having to go through systems that are more complex and you're either in or you're out.
Karyn, where are the biggest gaps, as you see it at the moment, for the sort of clients you're dealing with, cohort that you're
Well, we believe housing is foundational to a quality of life, and then a quality of life for people is different around their particular needs. So obviously people with intellectual disabilities need particular kind of supports. People with chronic disease, we need a lot more screening of people so that the health services can intervene earlier. They all go together, and I think basically our service systems are way too silo for people to actually be able to navigate, trying to navigate, the health system for a chronic disease, or what can they do for recovery, for addiction, as well as self-manage their mental illness. They need assistance with that because that's 3 systems in one.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got, well, how do you manage your housing and be a good tenant? How do you understand your obligations as a tenant? How do you, understand the mail that comes about what your obligations are if you're being breached? And often these things are left unattended to unless you've got intentional support that's going to really work with people in supporting them, not doing it for them, but supporting them to maintain their tenancy and to access the services they need to be healthy and well. And if they can have meaningful activity, all goes to employment and training.
With the way government services are configured, there's a department responsible for housing, another one for policing, another one for health, another one for education. How could those services be provided in a holistic way, given essentially the nature of government is to have individual responsibilities?
I think it starts at the top. We need better collaborative budgeting by government and really looking at, what is the cost benefit of building a prison versus how many public housing we're not going to build because we're building that prison. What is the consequences of high-end tertiary interventions when we're not putting a balanced investment into housing and getting people support for employment or meaningful activity. Reducing social isolation is a critical issue to preventing offending and recidivism.
Karyn, I wanted to ask if, in terms of your clients' particular needs, in regards to, say, women with children or men with children who may be homeless and may be at risk of offending.
That's an everyday occurrence.
Yes, I just want to ask in terms of any particular needs or gaps in service
clearly
delivery
that's where some silo work could be, addressed, and so that where people lose their children are removed and the cycle starts all over again. The rate of out-of-home care and juvenile justice that has been shown in adults, we should be now paying attention to how can we prevent this generation from having that same trajectory. And housing is critical to that. People lose their income when they move, their children are removed, so then they've got to try and rebuild their life without the necessarily money to be able to pay the rent you need to have for a 3-bedroom house versus a 1-bedroom. But I think early intervention around supporting families and letting families nominate the support they need before they get to be a matter of concern. Certainly there could be more targeted support to families who have a member of the family in prison. The high rates of children are significant who have a father or a mother in jail, and I think the services for those households and those families could be more targeted in a way that can support those predominantly women and children, manage, what needs to change, how can they get stability, how's the reintegration when their partner comes out of prison going to happen. Clearly we need a lot of more services available for drug and alcohol, for recovery and for opportunities for employment for families, because often they're younger, so they do have the chance, they do have a pathway for employment if they can be supported to get the work that they're going to get a job, not something that's just ticking a box to say they've done a program. Some people have done heaps of training but never actually get into the job market.
Karyn, somebody turns up to Micah, a client, fresh out of prison, say, no job, relationships in trouble, no housing. If housing's a priority, clearly, if they contact the Department of Housing, what happens? What's it look like when somebody comes out, they need accommodation urgently?
Well, the easiest thing to do is the housing application form, but not everyone does it. So people have to be referred to an agency that will do the housing application form. People will need assistance to get ID. People will then be prioritised according to need. People may not have high need or not. It depends on how they fill out the form.
So days, weeks or months can go by?
Oh, years. Yes. So, but there are opportunities to get into the private rental market, which some people take. They're just not as sustainable as social housing in terms of affordability, because the market's up and down. People may sell the properties, or we're seeing a lot of stress after about 18 months because rents go up or the house is being sold. So, the cost saving is in stability, not in people going through systems all the time. But there are things that people can access. So if people come to our service or any other homeless funded service, they would get assistance to be referred to those sort of products, they call them. So whether it's rent assistance or a bond loan, but people have to go through, well, what's their history been, what's their tenancy history, so we have to help them document that. And then, of course, some people are discriminated. Certainly Indigenous people can't get into the private rental market as easy. If people have a criminal history, it can be an issue. The odds are against them. It's a lot of navigating multiple systems.
Thank you.
How many people are sleeping rough by choice?
None, as far as I'm concerned. People may answer that question, I don't want a house. They don't want a house as they perceived it's being offered and what they've lived in before, or that they don't feel they can navigate, or they're unwell. And sometimes it's about working through that process with them, and certainly working with them what is the kind of housing. It's not just one size fits all, but what would work for them, because it's really hard to get. Some people are still on the streets for 5 years more that we know, and it's getting the right housing type that's going to suit their circumstances, their behaviours, their abilities in some cases. So it's really making sure that we do a much better job of matching the right housing with the right person and the right level of services that people need.
Thank you, Karyn. Have you finished?
I've got one or two more questions. People that are significantly cognitively impaired, is there hope at the end of the day for somebody that really is struggling to manage life, sleeping rough, accessing services from time to time, but may also be battling significant chronic illnesses of various sorts? Is there a place for them?
There's definitely hope. We just need to fund it right. So it's about the housing with the services, and don't expect one social worker to have all the skills. You will need clinicians. You will need most people who are rough sleeping, who have intellectual disabilities, they've had experiences of abuse. There's been a significant abuse of power. 25% of the people that are on the streets were in out-of-home care and experienced abuse, from people who are 17 today to people who are 80. So people who, as the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Abuse has demonstrated, that this is a much bigger population. And Queensland has one of the highest rates of people going to the Royal Commission in the prisons because of their experience of childhood sexual abuse in detention centre, or if they were in as a 17-year-old in an adult prison. So those experiences don't mean that people can just rock up and trust you. So we have to have the ability to work with people to gain their trust, and also to problem solve together so that the right solution for them can be found, rather than an imposition and saying, well, you've got to take this or it's nothing. And recognise that some people need constant support because their abilities are different.
Over the next, say, 12 months, if there was funding out there and if things were different, what are the building blocks we need to put in place over the next 1 to 2 years? What are the first major things that you would do if you...
Well, we definitely have to address housing and make that housing as stable as it can be, or a pathway. There is some evidence in other countries that transitional housing does have a place with post-release, as long as when it's finished there is a pathway to secure tenancy and housing. And that would be true of a lot of areas. I think there needs to be, services, obviously, with the number of people going in for breaches of domestic violence. There needs to be more issues around how are people going to resolve that and the relationships that they've got. How are they going to resolve living in the community, even though they've got protection orders? People need to navigate that system so that they're not breaching all the time. And they need to know that violence is wrong, that, relationships need to be safe. And it's about getting the investment that isn't so quick that you've got to finish it in 6 months, because that's just not going to happen. But we've got to get the capital investment alongside the services investment, and as much as possible join them up, because at the moment we've got a lot of fragmentation. And, really looking at the data and looking at, well, what is the data saying about what people's needs are, and then across government have a collaborative plan that says which department will invest how much money and how do they work together, and then how do the programs that are funded work in a multidisciplinary way versus a whole lot of silos.
I agree with your answer. That's
Thank you.
Pretty strong view of the world. Do you have anything?
No, I've got no further questions.
Are there any comments from the floor on what we've heard so far? Would anybody care to make a comment?
I probably will.
Please.
Good morning.
I think the other thing with people living on the streets and homeless too and trying to find accommodation is what they do with their pets. And often those pets are family. They're the only form of protection that people have if they're out on the street living rough. Yet the housing markets can often deny people access to housing because of the pet. And with the young people I've worked with, they've often said, my pet can't come with me, I'll stay where I am. And I think that's another area that we need to be looking at as well.
Well, that's just a rule that can be changed. But
it's an important thing.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And I do think we need investment into Indigenous managed services that are connected up with their health systems as well, because people need to reconnect with culture as a basic protective principle. It's not just about someone being culturally competent. It's people have been really disconnected to it, and it's trauma upon trauma, and those issues need to be resolved within the context of self-determination and Indigenous managed services, connecting the dots with what they already have, the systems that are already in place, like a fantastic primary healthcare system, and making sure that those, connections are maintained over time.
Thank you. We've definitely heard about housing, access to services, and health matters multiple times from multiple contributors to our body of work here. There's no question you're hitting the main issues out there.
I'd just like to say that I think it needs to be a partnership approach with the community sector, that it isn't something government can do alone, and a referral pathway doesn't do it on its own. That the design of the programs is really critical, and then the voluntary engagement, the time and relationship building, which we're sort of losing in our community services procurement processes these days. And I think they need to be really valued, that, you need a safety net. You don't just need a referral.
Yeah. Could you unpack that just a little further? When you say you think we're losing it, are you able to provide examples?
Well, I think a lot of us get funding now where, all referrals have to come from this prison, or all referrals have to come from this hospital, or a person can't come in and say, I want a service, I want to work with you, unless they go through, there would be examples. You don't want people to have to offend before they can get a service.
No.
You don't want someone who has served their time for a crime that they've committed and have been accountable and to be labelled an ex-prisoner all their life. We want to maintain healthy levels of citizenship that allow people to have the safety net they deserve as a right, and that includes healthcare and housing and individualised support if there's disability or mental illness that's ongoing. So I think there has to be a bit more trust in government and the not-for-profit sector working together to design those programs to get those outcomes, because you're never going to get it just by a database that says, well, we're referring from here to there and you finish in 6 months. That's not going to achieve the outcome you need. We're talking about generations of poverty and trauma, and, as the evidence has showed, people being in and out of the criminal justice system. So we have to put the same investment into the solution. And often the investment that goes into the solution is half the price. And so we need to value this as something that a healthy society needs. A healthy society needs people. And in the end, it saves money because people are healthier and supported and have a place to live. Whereas I think all the evidence is showing the more we cut these things, and some of them are Commonwealth issues, in terms of the way our income security is no longer a safety net. It's very punitive. If people don't keep a set of rules and regulations, they lose income, and then that means that there's a whole set of consequences. So the state can't solve all those things, but the state could choose to do rent subsidies if they want to, or put in more money to support people earlier to navigate that income system so that it doesn't end up that basically people have no income for 3 months and they have to live on the street because they've been breached of their income. That's not a safety net. And that's blaming the individual versus looking at what are the foundational blocks we need as a society to have a healthy society for everyone and not leave people behind, not have the inequality grow. That's what we've fundamentally got to look at, not you only get this service if you're meeting the obligations, or you're excluded, because that's not going to work for the people we're talking about.
No.
Thank you.
I'm so glad that you're out there and others like you who are worrying about people that are vulnerable and in need. So keep up the good work, and I hope we can be of some assistance through our process
I thought your paper was great.
Thank you. Thank you, Karyn.
Just on the draft paper, the draft report, there's some data, and our previous public hearing and our consultations to date, people have said, there was components not in there, and there was some components around Indigenous data not in there, and some other cross-linked data. At the time of the draft report, we hadn't received some of that information. We have now, so that will be in the final report. So I wanted to assure people here today that will be in. And just as Karyn's highlighted in her presentation around some correlations between, people who have had their children removed or in fact been resulted in being removed as a child and now grown up, along with women or men and people with mental health issues. There's direct, and we found in the data there's significant combinations of those now and factors relating across the groups as well. So if someone's been in custody, in child protection or had children removed and have a mental illness, they're more than likely to end up in the criminal justice system. So the data
Which isn't a great outcome for that investment.
Well, the data speaks to that now,
Yeah.
so we have the data.
Yeah, so thank you for doing the report and the commission, because I think it's a really critical part of evidence that we all need to get the investment rebalanced.
We hope that the final report, which will include a comprehensive data analysis and provide some pretty confronting statistics, by the way, from the data we're seeing so far, but we now have that. We're currently going through the unpacking process. We will flesh out, we think, considerably the current state of play and will help refine the recommendations. It should be said that we don't come up with recommendations out of thin air. This public consultation process is crucial for us, and the sorts of evidence we'll hear today will shape and drive the recommendations we make. You did a great job, Karyn.
Thank you.
It's much appreciated. Keep up the good work. Thank you.